On the 18th of December 1572, a Spanish army under Don Fadrique Álvarez de Toledo opened fire on the Dutch city of Haarlem. This marked the beginning of a siege characterized by extensive mine warfare, a naval battle on the Sea of Haarlem, the Haarlemmermeer, and the valiant efforts of armed citizens, including the famous Kenau Simonsdochter Hasselaer. The stakes were high. Haarlem had thrown its lot in with the Dutch Revolt, determined to free itself from the grip of Spanish rule. Don Fadrique wanted to nip this uprising in the bud by wiping out Haarlem and its rebellious inhabitants. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Haarlem. In 1566, Dutch rebels rose against their ruler, Philip II of Spain, a fervent Catholic. When Protestant resistance fighters unleashed a wave of iconoclastic fury, Philip opted for open confrontation. He installed Fernando Álvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, known as the Iron Duke, as governor of the Spanish Netherlands, and instructed him to, quote, eradicate Protestantism and disobedience through inquisition and public executions, as well as to abolish the privileges of the Dutch nobility and the autonomy of the cities and to introduce stricter taxes. Alba was ruthless and uncompromising in fulfilling this mission. Among other things, he established the so-called Council of Troubles, a tribunal that could summon and convict anyone, regardless of rank or name, allowing Alba to eliminate enemies of his king under the guise of justice. According to some estimates, he had between 1,000 and 6,000 dissenting nobles executed and many more expropriated. Among those summoned to appear before the Council of Troubles was the leader of the rebels, one of the most powerful noblemen in the Netherlands, William of Orange, also known as William the Silent. After defying the summons and facing ostracism, William attempted to break Alba's iron grip by invading the Netherlands, aiming to spark a nationwide rebellion. This offensive is often considered the first act of the 80 Years' War, but it was a miserable failure. William's forces were driven back, and the Dutch fight for independence seemed to be over before it had even begun. But then the famous watergeuzen, known in English as the Sea Beggars, entered the scene. These privateers backed the rebellion, putting pressure on the Spanish by raiding ships and harbors, severely limiting their freedom of movement. In 1572, they captured Den Briel in Holland, sparking a renewed wave of resistance. One by one, towns joined the rebels, including Haarlem, Alkmaar, and Leiden. After the Sea Beggars also captured Middelburg, the provinces of Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht recognized William of Orange as their stadtholder, or steward. With this newfound support, William launched a second invasion. In response, Alba mounted a counter-offensive, capturing Valenciennes before laying siege to Mons. After the garrison surrendered on the 19th of September, the campaign shifted into a punitive mission. The Spanish captured Mechelen and brutally sacked the city in what became known as the Spanish Fury, prompting many towns in the southern Netherlands to once again swear allegiance to Alba. To restore order in the north as well, the Iron Duke sent his son, Fadrique Álvarez de Toledo. Don Fadrique sacked Zutphen, slaughtering hundreds of inhabitants, which sent shockwaves through towns in Gelderland, Overijssel, and Friesland, driving them to collapse under the threat of similar brutality. He then advanced to Amsterdam, making an example of Naarden. Although the town opened its gates to him, Don Fadrique gathered nearly the entire population in the church and had set it ablaze. In the days that followed, thousands of news sheets spread the story of the Naarden massacre throughout the northern provinces. These early forms of mass media, made possible by the printing press, then just over a century old, amplified the horror. The pro-independent faction seized the moment, using the massacre not only to stoke outrage, but to rally resistance. History teaches us a crucial lesson. The news had always been a double-edged sword, capable of illuminating truth, but also spreading propaganda, educating the public while simultaneously shaping opinion. That lesson feels more urgent today than ever. In an age where ad-driven algorithms reward outrage and division, many news outlets now cater to specific ideological audiences, reinforcing bias rather than challenging it. That's where this episode's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. I've been using Ground News to stay informed for quite some time, because every day they group tens of thousands of stories from across the political spectrum and highlight the bias behind each source. For example, when the International Monetary Fund forecasted a slowdown in global economic growth, over 400 sources across the political spectrum reported on the story, emphasizing different outcomes. Left-leaning sources usually frame the impact on projected growth as a direct consequence of Trump's tariffs, emphasizing that layoffs would be inevitable, while right-leaning sources, while admitting a worsening outlook, also emphasize the IMF's historically optimistic projections during crises. This kind of polarization in the media isn't new, but understanding it is more important than ever. Ground News helps you to do just that, providing the context you need to see every story from multiple perspectives. Their news bias dashboard even tracks your personal news consumption, helping you identify blind spots and become a more informed reader. Speaking of blind spots, their blind spot feature shows stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. For example, many right-leaning people probably missed the fact that right-wing commentator Candace Owens recently stated Trump suppresses speech by his actions against Harvard. By showing you how various outlets lean politically, Ground News lets you explore multiple sides of the same story, giving you the context needed to separate fact from spin. Subscribe today and get 40% off the Vantage plan for unlimited access by scanning the QR code or visiting groundnews.com/SandRhoman. The offer is for a limited time, so remember to use my link in the description to subscribe. Stay informed, not influenced. By massacring the inhabitants of a town that had already surrendered, Don Fadrique went too far. Rather than further intimidating the insurgents, he transformed the rebellion into a desperate fight for survival of the cities of the northern provinces. Alba's next target was the small town of Haarlem, strategically positioned on a crucial land route between North and South Holland. By capturing it, he hoped to sever the rebels in North Holland from those in the south, defeating them one group at a time. When the city council of Haarlem learned that the Spaniards were advancing, the frightened council members sent a delegation to Amsterdam to negotiate with Don Fadrique and beg for mercy. However, as they journeyed, Wigbold Ripperda, the governor of Haarlem, convinced the city guard to remain loyal to William of Orange and the rebellion. In a bold move, they overthrew the council and replaced it with citizens who, like Ripperda, refused to negotiate. Haarlem was determined to fight for its freedom. On the 11th of December 1572, Don Fadrique arrived near Haarlem, leading an army of 14,000 men. In stark contrast, Haarlem's garrison consisted of just 2,000 soldiers, and its defenses were clearly outdated. The city was surrounded by an 8-meter-high wall and a moat, but the fortifications dated back to the early 15th century. The only modern feature was a ravelin positioned directly in front of the Kruisport, the eastern gate. Semicircular towers, serving as artillery platforms, reinforced the old wall at intervals of roughly 100 meters. Confident in his overwhelming numbers, Don Fadrique assumed the march to Haarlem would be a veritable walk in the park. The first to oppose the Spaniards was Lumi, whose full name was William II de la Marck, Admiral of the Sea Beggars, and Deputy Stadtholder of William of Orange in Holland. On the 13th of December, he attempted to halt Don Fadrique's advance with 4,000 men at the Manpad, a side road between Leiden and Haarlem. However, his forces were vastly outmatched by Don Fadrique's seasoned troops. The Spaniards opened the battle with a relentless barrage, maintaining their fire until Lumi's men began to falter. At that point, the Spaniards surged into close combat, routing the rebels. This defeat stunned the defenders of Haarlem so much that they offered to surrender to the Spaniards, hoping they would be spared. but the Iron Duke and his son refused. At that point, they had no choice. They owed their men several months' pay, but lacked the funds to settle the debt. The only thing keeping the troops from mutiny was the prospect of plundering Haarlem. After the offer of surrender, Don Fadrique grew even more confident that he would quickly take Haarlem. He gave little thought to his approach, setting up a fortified camp and several gun emplacements on the flat, easily accessible terrain outside the city. When the batteries were ready on the 18th of December, he began a short but intense bombardment. Within 2 days, the Spanish guns were out of ammunition. Don Fadrique then ordered an assault on the wall of the Kruisport, which had borne the brunt of the attack. This ill-advised charge was likely a result of overconfidence, as the Spaniards met unexpectedly fierce resistance and were forced to retreat. The rapid assault had failed, and Don Fadrique had to pause the siege to procure more ammunition. Seizing the opportunity, William of Orange sent 600 reinforcements to Haarlem on the 29th of December. Supplies also began flowing in as the city was not fully surrounded. The Spanish struggled to block these shipments particularly by water. This was because the river Sparne connected Haarlem with the Haarlemmermeer, a large floodplain where Amsterdam Schiphol Airport stands today. The sea beggars regularly brought troops, food and other supplies into the city via this route. On the 8th of January, Don Fadrique reported to King Philip, quote, "The city is very large, and we can do nothing to prevent the enemy from entering and leaving at will. This is the reason why they are holding out so well." It was now clear to everyone that the siege would be anything but a swift victory. The Spanish guns resumed their bombardment on the same day Don Fadrique wrote to the king. This time, the Spaniards focused on cutting off Haarlem's supply lines, advancing toward the city far more cautiously than they had in December, meter by meter, using approach trenches. On the 15th of January, they reached the ravine before the Kruisport and occupied it without resistance. But the harsh winter began to take its toll on the Spanish army. Cold, snow and disease steadily weakened their numbers, while Haarlem's garrison grew stronger with continuous reinforcements. When Don Fadrique launched another assault on the 31st of January, his exhausted troops were met by a formidable force: 3,500 to 4,000 soldiers, 600 militia members, and over 1,000 armed citizens. Among them was a company of women led by the legendary Kenau Simonsdochter Hasselaer. Kenau, nearly 50 at the time, was no ordinary citizen. She ran her late husband's shipyard and was known for her fierce temperament and refusal to back down from conflict. During the assault, she and her group hurled stones and bricks at the attackers, and even engaged in hand-to-hand combat with swords and spears. Kenau is often portrayed as a stout, stocky woman with masculine features, and to this day a particularly domineering woman in the Netherlands might be called a ware Kenau, though not always as a compliment. Regardless of legend and exaggeration, what's certain is that the defenders of Haarlem, united and determined, successfully repelled the second Spanish assault. This second defeat was especially bitter for the Spaniards, who made a grim discovery during their advance. The defenders of Haarlem had constructed a second line of fortifications. Behind the Kruisport stood a new, sturdy wall of earth and rubble, reinforced with several bastions. Even if the outer gate fell, it would offer the attackers no meaningful advantage. Morale in the Spanish camp plummeted. One dejected captain lamented, quote, "Who would believe that we are no further than we were on the first day of the siege?" Some officers even began to advocate for abandoning the siege altogether, but Don Fadrique refused to hear of it. Enraged and determined to punish the city for its resistance, he vowed to make the defenders pay for his setbacks. In a grim display meant to break their spirit, he ordered a scaffold erected in front of the city walls and had his Dutch prisoners executed. The response from Haarlem was both defiant and mocking. The defenders hurled loaves of bread over the walls toward the starving Spanish troops. This bold gesture made it painfully clear that the besiegers had yet to sever the city's supply lines. The Spanish then resumed their slow, methodical advance. They extended their trench system above ground and began tunneling underground. Spanish miners dug beneath Haarlem's defenses to place explosive charges, but they frequently encountered resistance. The defenders had also started digging, building so-called countermines to intercept and neutralize the charges before detonation. When the two sides' tunnels met, brutal close-quarter battles erupted in the narrow, underground passages. By spring, both camps focused on disrupting each other's supply lines. An insurgent army attempted to sever the Spanish connection to their headquarters in Utrecht, sailing from Hoorn and Enkhuizen. With 24 ships across the IJsselmeer, they landed and occupied the Diemer Dike, the dike between Muiden and Amsterdam. But before the Spanish began to suffer from this disruption, loyalist troops from Amsterdam counterattacked and drove the rebels back. The Spanish, however, proved more effective. After blocking Haarlem's overland supply routes, they turned their attention to the waterways. In an effort to cut off replenishments via the Haarlemmermeer, the Count of Bossu transported a fleet to the lake and launched a naval assault on the sea beggars operating there on the 26th of May 1573. After a fierce, hours-long battle, the beggars were forced to retreat, conceding control of the waters to the Spanish. This defeat in the Battle of the Haarlemmermeer cut off Haarlem's last connection to the outside world. Within weeks, the city began to run out of food. The population struggled to survive, first eating whatever animals they could find, then chewing leather from shoes and belts. Finally, they began to starve. On the 8th of July, William of Orange made a final attempt to relieve Haarlem. Once again, he sent 4,000 men across the Manpad, but once again they were repelled by the Spanish. Just 4 days later, on the 13th of July 1573, Haarlem surrendered unconditionally. Don Fadrique promised to spare the city in exchange for 240,000 guilders in reparations. Haarlem agreed, but the son of the Iron Duke kept only part of his word. While he spared the civilian population, he executed Governor Wigbold Ripperda and the entire garrison, except for the German mercenaries, because he knew that otherwise he would not be able to recruit in their homeland in the future. When the executioners grew weary from swinging their axes, the remaining soldiers were tied together and drowned in the river Sparne. Despite this bloody revenge, the conquest of Haarlem was a Pyrrhic victory. The siege had cost the Spanish over 6 months and some 10,000 men. Rather than crushing the Dutch Revolt, it had intensified resistance and proved that the Spanish were not invincible. Still, Don Fadrique had achieved his immediate strategic aim. Haarlem was in Spanish hands, and rebellious Holland was split in two. His next objective was its northern part, the Noorder Kwartier. Soon, Don Fadrique marched his army toward the small but well-fortified town of Alkmaar. Hey, we hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to support our work, check out our Patreon. Even just a few dollars a month help us improve and keep making these videos. If you're into military fiction, sci-fi, or want to see which history books we recommend, take a look at our Amazon storefront. And lastly, don't forget to explore Ground News, a great tool to avoid falling into the trap of biased reporting. Stay informed, not influenced.